Yeah, welcome, and thanks for being here today. Today we're going to be talking about sales and operations planning, IBP or integrated business planning, and more specifically the human component of S&OP. As we know, S&OP really strives to engage stakeholders from a company into a process around um, sales, around operations, around finance. However, we have opposing views on forecast, inventory, and supply, and these often lead to conflict. And of course, left unresolved, this can really impede the success of our sales and operations process. We're going to talk about the S&OP and IBP process, and obviously before we jump into conflict, causes of conflict, how to resolve conflict, and actually how to utilize conflict to our advantage, we first want to provide an overview of what is S&OP and IBP, what is not S&OP and IBP, what are the
Yeah.
processes involved. So when we talk about IBP and S&OP, what is from your perspective, what is the process involved in sales and operations planning?
Well, first and foremost, don't take it from my perspective. We're not a practice, and I'm not a practitioner that pretends to have invented something new. There's plenty of consultancies out there that try to put a spin on it and call it something fancy and new and improved. But the reality is, S&OP today is the same thing that it has been since it was introduced in the 80s. Which isn't to say we haven't learned things about it and haven't learned ways to improve it. And certainly technology has reduced a lot of latency in the process and allowed it to be more agile. But S&OP and IBP from the beginning have been a very tightly prescribed set of 5 management meetings that take place on a monthly cycle, beginning with a look at the portfolio, looking at products that are in the let's say exceptional points of their life, so new product introductions, end of life products, as well as a portfolio review. These exceptional products are then fed to the demand review process, where the totality of global demand is evaluated. We're looking at an unconstrained view of what customers would take from us if they could, with no consideration given to whether or not we think our capacity can manage that, whether or not our raw material can manage that, et cetera. This is the blue sky view. From there, our supply planning team creates a constrained supply plan, which tells us, of the blue sky view, what we think is the realistic expectation of our being able to deliver it. And that takes into consideration machine capacity, labor availability, raw material availability, and network considerations. And the output of that then becomes the constrained supply plan, or the plan of record. The next step of IBP or S&OP is integrated reconciliation, where we turn this plan of record, our best attempt at executing to all of the customer demand, into a dollarized plan. So we have an idea about what it'll cost us to meet that demand. We have an idea about what revenue we will raise for meeting that demand, and obviously as a result, we'll have an idea about what our gross profit is going to be over that period. I don't want to belabor this is not meant to be an IBP boot camp, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but I do want to point out a lot of organizations already by this point have made a major disconnect in their IBP or S&OP processes. And a lot of the posts you see on LinkedIn and a lot of the white papers you read about why isn't S&OP meeting the needs of finance executives, or why is S&OP in organizations failing, it's because this integrated reconciliation step, or the financial step, hasn't been linked to the right place. It's been linked to the demand forecast. So month after month, the organization gets perpetually disappointed because the cash flow that's supposed to arise from that unconstrained demand never materializes because it's unconstrained.
Yeah.
So organizations doing S&OP or IBP properly at this point, which is a critical juncture in the 5-step process, are linking to the constrained supply planning step to make their estimations of what cash flows are going to be. And then the final step of the process is executive review, where we gain insight from the metrics on each of these different steps,
Hmm.
IBP is very much a metrics-driven process. We
Hmm.
agree on metrics, we agree on their calculation, we agree on the data origins, and most importantly, we agree on what actions to take when we run outside of particular thresholds on these metrics. And the other thing we look at the executive review level is what does the future look like? So what is our estimation of demand? What are the anomalies? What are the exceptions? Do we have any concerns about being able to meet it? Do we have capitalization requirements, labor fluctuations, either overtime or furloughs, things like that? It's basically a high-level view at the end of the process to make sure that the senior leadership team knows where we're going and understands how we got to the point we're at. So when you look at this cycle, I mean, it seems pretty tightly prescribed, and it should be. And the idea is we want to get input from across the organization so that all the people who understand, who need to know what's going on in each of these steps know. I mean, why would there be conflict? But the reality is, because every one of these steps is supposed to end on action, and this is the other place that a lot of organizations fall down.
Hmm.
They set up 5 meetings, they set up some really nice decks, and a pile of people come into a room and watch a person present the deck, and then they all leave. Uh, IBP is meant to be a decision-making process. The deck is
Hmm.
supposed to have been distributed beforehand so everyone can come to that meeting and make decisions. And the reality is, when you're looking at balancing the expectations or
Hmm.
motivations or incentivizations of, say, the sales organization, they're very different than the expectations and motivations and incentivizations of, for instance, the finance organization or the operations organization. And what I mean by that is we're often incentivizing different behaviors for salespeople who we expect to go out and be optimistic and go and find us new business, often at any cost. Well, at the same time,
Hmm.
we tell our operations and finance folks we need to be fiscally prudent. We don't want to be sitting on mountains of inventory. We don't want to risk write-offs. Your behaviors need to be much different. We need you to manage cash flow. We need you to be risk averse. And so when we pull these people into a meeting, and this is the third thing that I think a lot of organizations do wrong, and expect to have consensus at the end of the meeting, I think it's a crazy notion. Um, we don't need consensus. And I think consensus is unhealthy. And the reason I say that is because I don't think it's in any way realistic to believe that senior leaders from across an organization,
Hmm.
from various different parts of the organization, could possibly agree on a single number for sales 7 or 8 months out. First of all, you're always going to have it wrong. You will
Hmm.
never have that number right. And secondly, I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's healthy for everyone to be nodding in agreement because you all have different perspectives. So IBP done well, it becomes a place where people with different perspectives have a forum to voice these different perspectives so that we can weigh these different perspectives and
Hmm.
ultimately directionally agree on a path forward. But that's different than consensus. And we'll get into a definition of consensus later, but I'm sowing the seed of where some of these conflicts come from. The conflicts come from the fact that we're all incentivized in different ways. We all have different things that are important to us personally as well as
Hmm.
professionally. And often organizations set up these different departments to be at odds with each other, often
Hmm.
unknowingly.
So to quickly summarize what you're saying here, so we're looking at a process that's a relatively high level process. So we're not going into the weeds of, how much are we going to order tomorrow? How much are we going to produce tomorrow? What are we bringing in? It's really a process that looks out 6, 18 months,
Yeah, 18, not
instead of
6.
18, not 6. And based on that, we make decisions. So if we're looking at the actual conflict comes obviously from having different departments involved that have different targets, different mentalities. And I think it's very fair where you say sales is expected to be positive. It's expected to go somewhere where you didn't think was possible. And on the other hand, we have finance who has to be cautious of the amount of money they have, the amount of money they spend. isn't the S&OP process therefore also not the place where you actually, how do you say, make decisions with finance? So let's say, let's go a bit scenario based. So you want to approach a new market, you make a plan, and that will cost you or set you back X amount of money. And then, we go to finance and say, okay, we can't do that. But isn't it the place to actually make those things possible? Like together, build a plan that is something that we all want to go after. Finance is in charge of making sure that we have the money available, and sales is in charge of actually targeting the right market, getting into the markets, putting their people out there. So isn't it that conflict is actually something that shouldn't arise, because it's actually the place where we already make the plan, right? Isn't that
Yeah,
consensus?
I think to begin with, before we got to the part of what you were saying that I agree less with, the part that I fully agree with is absolutely S&OP is a high level process.
Mm-hmm.
It's focused on strategy. It's focused on a strategic horizon. Um, and it's supported by a lot of granular processes, tactical
Mm-hmm.
processes, blocking and tackling processes.
Mm-hmm.
But the S&OP or IBP that a lot of organizations do is too focused in the here and now and too focused on how many units of this SKU am I going to sell 2 months from now because this particular customer has been shorted. That's not
Mm-hmm.
S&OP.
Yeah.
That's a problem that needs solving as a result of not having done S&OP in the first place, which was advanced warning and advanced planning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you're spot on there. That's absolutely the case. That being said, I don't think it makes a difference whether or not S&OP or IBP is, and you know what, for the balance of this conversation, I'm just going to call it IBP. And when we get into questions, I can tell you all why I think they're the exact same thing. And
Mm-hmm.
anybody can disagree with me, and I'm happy to have that conversation. But for now, let's just agree that I'm using IBP interchangeably with S&OP.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter if IBP is tactical or strategic. It doesn't matter if it's looking at 2 months or 18 months where conflict is concerned. Um, Conflict arises not just from the fact these various different departments have their own different objectives, their own different incentivizations, their own different motivations, but the fact that they're staffed with people who themselves have all these different motivations and personalities.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the very reason that um, that diversity and inclusiveness are so important
Mm-hmm.
in corporate settings. It's not because it's a socially nice thing to do. It's not because you want to tick an ESG box or be able to brag to shareholders that you employ X number of visible minorities or
Mm-hmm.
X percent of a particular gender. You've missed the point if that's why you're doing it. Diversity is precisely what we want to have in decision-making processes like IBP because we don't want everyone agreeing.
Mm-hmm.
When we have everyone agreeing, we end up with situations like the 86 Challenger disaster, which is a classic. I mean, this is a university taught case study of what happens when you get groupthink. You had 18 really, really smart guys, and they were all guys, make no mistake, who all went to the same handful of schools, who all studied the same thing, who probably came from the same 3 states, and who were arguably the best rocket scientists in the whole world at the time. Now, for those of you who know the case, there's a pile of other exogenous factors like Congress looking at defunding NASA, a lot of pressure from NASA's administration on the launch team to launch. But even if you take that off the table, when you look at the science of the question, are we safe to launch? You had these 18 guys who all said yes.
Mm-hmm.
Those of you who know the case know there were some people who were dissenting, but they weren't part of the inner sanctum and they were overruled. And this is kind of the mindset, the old style mindset of management in the 80s and 90s and even the aughts, where we thought that staffing boards or staffing senior management with people with similar backgrounds, which facilitated rapid decision making and had us all of one mind so there was no conflict. So we were all, like you were saying, Danny, looking at the same thing. We want to go the same place, and we all agree on the same way to get there. This feels like a highly functioning team. And I'll tell another story in a moment about exactly why that is not. The problem is when everyone is nodding in agreement, no one has slowed down to look at all the pitfalls that are waiting for you. And make no mistake, they're always there. And this is what happened to NASA. With no one to challenge them and everyone with the same perspectives and backgrounds, no one slowed down to ask a very basic question about the data that we now know, which would have been, can we please look at the data for the successful launches when the temperatures were higher for the O-rings? And if they would have taken that and coupled it with the cold weather launches for the O-rings, they would have seen a very clear logistic regression that would have shown when you launch below this temperature, you will have secondary O-ring failure and it will blow up. So the second story is this. There's a great business school case called the Everest expedition, and this is all about conflict. Actually, it's framed in terms of being all about consensus. And I know people that do IBP love the idea of consensus. We're all going to get along. We're all going to get into this boardroom and look at the details, and we're all going to agree on the way forward. And on the rare occasions that naturally and honestly can happen, that's fantastic. But it isn't necessarily healthy. What the Everest expedition points out is, and I'm going to do that, A, the nutshell version, because we have a lot of other material to go through, and B, I don't want to spoil it for anybody who may end up doing business school and it comes across this. But the end result of this expedition, where you're in a group of 5 and you all have a role to play, is that the groups who made decisions quickly and felt they were really collaborating very well invariably end up dying on the side of the mountain because they haven't slowed down to disagree with each other about the path forward and really interrogate the data and interrogate the situation. I can, without any shame, tell you, I thought I was in a highly functioning group, and 3 of us died. I mean, we were positive we were collaborating like at the best level possible. But yeah, we did a terrible job because we were working too hard to agree. We were working too hard to get along. And that isn't what effective decision making is about. And so that's sort of leading to conflict in IBP. We're not talking about, open fights and disagreement, but it's the idea that we need to shift our mindset away from the need from consensus, which is not healthy, to the idea that this is a safe place to collaborate and invite conflicting points of view so that at the end of that process, we have directional agreement on a path forward. And ultimately, someone owns the process, and ultimately that person's going to have to say this is the decision. And the beauty of IBP is that all those dissenting voices are not ignored. It's a closed loop process. So in the post-mortem, month after month, those people who disagreed have an opportunity to be vindicated because we are measuring everything. We're measuring the decisions we made, we're testing the assumptions, and we're making it very clear afterwards so that we can learn from it and we can course correct. I think we're probably a couple of slides behind at this point.
Yeah, probably. My dislike for slides, but we talked a bit about everything on here already.
You can skip this. You know what? Is there one more slide? After that, I think we can turn off the slide.
There is one more slide. Yes. Yeah. I kind of wanted to, you gave some really good real life cases. We applied that to business and to what S&OP IBP is. So if as a company we're taking decisions about our direction, about the products that we're going to sell, about the markets we're going to target. So basically you're saying if we're, let's say we would start a company together, Jonathan. We're both white, bald,
Dutch.
Let's
start a cheese company.
Let's start a cheese company, yes, which only sells Gouda. That's actually where we're starting, right? Like, if we have our cultural backgrounds, and if we would start a cheese company, we wouldn't see the need for cheeses that we've not grown up with, because
we would probably agree on many things.
We'll probably agree on many things, yes. Like, yeah, as we said, Gouda for the English crowd, or Gouda, as we Dutch would like to say, is
Yep.
obviously one of the better cheeses in the world. Why would we sell anything else? Why would we sell a brie or a camembert, or why would we introduce cheaper or
And it's not even just
yes.
about tastes and preferences
Mhm,
and common cultural experiences, Danny.
mhm,
It's also about and this is again the value of diversity. It's differences in thought
mhm,
processes. I
mhm,
mean, Western education, particularly North American or Western European education, teaches people to think a particular way.
mhm,
Um, that is not the standard for all systems of education around the world.
mhm,
And as a result, you have much different ways of approaching problems in different parts of the world than you do
mhm,
in for instance, North America. And it's sometimes frustrating for those unaccustomed to working with people from different places with different approaches to problems to have to slow down and either explain one's logic for what to yourself seems like an obvious decision, or entertain an input or
mhm,
an opposing decision from someone else. I had a member of my team. Um, his his background doesn't matter, but he was definitely very different education to mine, very different background to mine,
mhm,
but a very technical guy, very good at implementation. And I used to call him Doctor No, because this guy had a reason to like disagree with
mhm,
anything we planned to do.
mhm,
And honestly, it got to the point where I was considering, having to make a change, because I was finding it extremely frustrating to have
mhm,
to explain why I thought particular decisions or paths forward made the most sense when everyone else also agreed, and it was just Dr. No disagreeing. And I had the great fortune of doing this program on leading change and organizational renewal at Harvard Business School, where I also did this Everest expedition. And again, not ashamed to say, this is where I learned um, why diversity matters. I mean, to that point, I had just thought, hey, I'm a good person. I'm not going to block people who are different than me from being in leadership roles, which,
mhm,
you're a bad person if you do, obviously. But
mhm,
I didn't understand why, from a business standpoint rather than a social standpoint, it's
mhm,
important. And it's precisely because
mhm,
having people like Dr. No on your team to force you to slow down and consider what to you is an automatic response forces
mhm.
you to come out of. And do we still have Jeff Baker on the call? Yes, we do. Jeff, you'll like this. This is a Kahneman quote. It forces you out of that system one sort of reflexive thinking, where it's become habitual to do certain things, into that
Mhm.
system two type of thinking, where you're really engaging that prefrontal cortex and really slowing down and having to consider whether or not this is the most appropriate way forward.
Mhm.
The Yom Kippur War is another great example of groupthink, where as a result of flawed intelligence and everybody from the same background, no one thought it was possible that Israel was going to get invaded when they did, and they did.
Mhm.
And from that point forward, the Israeli Defense Force has what's now known as a 10th man rule, where if everybody agrees, someone has to take the role of disagreeing. And
Mhm.
this is all leading to why I think conflict done properly can be so healthy, and why, if I'm in your organization helping you implement S&OP or IBP, or
Mhm.
just coming by for a quarterly checkup or an audit, if I see everybody in any one of those five
Mhm.
meetings, if I see everyone in those five meetings nodding and agreeing, I begin cold calling people and asking them what do they think,
Mhm.
and trying to tease out that disagreement, because it's healthy. We need to hear the different perspectives.
So basically, you're advocating for having more devil's advocates in the room who kind of oppose the argument or
I think
oppose
I
the
think devil's
viewpoint, not
advocates,
as
Danny,
a.
are like a step one.
Mhm.
Um, I think creating a devil's advocate rule is the first step in creating a safe space in an
Mhm.
organization, a safe space culturally, where people are free
Mhm.
to disagree. And if you look at the footer of this, we talk about, how do we get
Mhm.
successful at IBP? You need three things. You need great people, you need great tools, and you need a great process. Um, the reason they're weighted differently here is it's just in terms of how likely you are to be successful having
Mhm.
the great version of one of those versus the others. Culture is the toughest thing to get. And a lot of organizations, when we first go in, they describe themselves as like, we're like a family. And when I hear that, I already think you're going to have a difficult journey, because we're like a family typically means no one wants to disagree in front of each other. But they'll come to us after the fact and tell us all the disagreement and
Mhm.
gossip and all the stuff that I don't need to know. And I think devil's advocate then it's a great first step, because it's a very tangible step that organizations that are not used to inviting conflict can make, to say, not only is it okay to disagree, but if we don't have any disagreement on this decision, I'm going to force someone to disagree. And then
Mhm.
after a period, I think people become not only more comfortable with the process of disagreeing, because in playing devil's advocate, it's not really about ego anymore. It's not really
Mhm.
your ego versus another person's ego, or who's going to win the disagreement. It's about, hey, I don't really necessarily believe this.
Mhm.
I'm just presenting an opposing view so that we have a better process as a
Mhm.
result. But a lot of organizations, a lot of people, in fact, are just not that comfortable with disagreeing constructively, and instead keep all those opposing views to themselves. And I think there's a lot of value in those opposing views. There's a lot of things that we can learn from those people who are afraid to speak up and disagree.
Mhm. And if we talk about, people having to speak up, what sort of, um, I was going to use the word accountability, because I think we're bringing different departments together, right? So sales has a target, marketing has targets, operations has certain targets.
I'm
Um,
smiling because typically, corporately, when someone says accountability, I think stick. I mean, as soon as someone's saying, how do we keep people accountable? I say, this is a person looking for an excuse to go beat up somebody else when they're wrong. But
but can it
continue.
also
I know
actually
you're
can it
not saying that.
force that disagreement, right? Because if we're trying to commit to a plan that we, are out of line with other department targets, is that not like the first, is it the leverage that somebody has if, not every person or personality, no, this is a high level, S&OP is in high, or should be in high level process. So there should be players in the room that definitely dare to speak up against each other. Otherwise, they might not want to be in the position or in the leadership position that they're in. But it's one of the tools we have to disagree with each other, right?
What, accountability?
No, I'm talking more about the KPIs that we're given,
Oh yeah. Well,
maybe
but here's
the
the thing about
targets we're given.
KPIs in an IBP framework, and
Hmm.
and I'm probably coming at this a little bit different culturally than a lot of other people, because a lot of my formative cultural years were in a Japanese organization. So I spent 7 years in a very old school Japanese organization where A, it's very KPIs driven, but B, there's this Japanese saying, that you fix the problem, not the blame. So you
Hmm.
spend time root causing, why did we miss, rather than who said that number and what are we going to do to them afterwards. Um,
Hmm.
and that's a shift for a lot of organizations too. I mean, KPIs are often misused. KPIs too often people use as scores,
Hmm.
and I don't think they're particularly useful as scores. I think from a growth and a corporate perspective, KPIs are much more useful to facilitate root cause and then take corrective action. So if we've got a miss on a metric, I agree there should be accountability.
Hmm.
But for me, the accountability is more about how did we collectively arrive at this point? I mean, even if it was,
Hmm.
Danny said we were going to sell a ton of chowda. So I was in operations, I ordered a ton of chowda. And we ended up selling only, you know, 200 kilos of chowda. So now my warehouse has 800 kilos full in it. And now I've got to call Slimstock to optimize my inventory.
We'll just
Um,
make aged
but
chowder.
the problem is not, well, it isn't a problem because you and I could eat it. But
Mm-hmm.
the problem isn't Danny said 1,000 kilos. I mean, unless Danny is like some
Mhm.
malicious psychopath that's just
Mhm.
looking to fill up my warehouse with Gouda. Danny got this information from somewhere. So the accountability isn't really about,
Mhm.
well, you know, Danny got it wrong.
Mhm.
It's what process led to the point that we got this information that on this month didn't end up being
Mhm.
correct. And and let's even take a step back from that and bear in mind, everyone likes saying it, but they forget that it's true. The forecast is always wrong. I mean,
Mhm.
always, always, always. So calibrating your operational strategy or even your
Mhm.
corporate strategy on the expectation that you're going to have a highly accurate forecast month after month is insane because it's not possible.
Mhm.
I mean, you gave me the plug, so I will mention it. I literally just wrote a book on the history of business
Mhm.
forecasting. I can tell you, we've made all kinds of technological advances. We've learned new things, but fundamentally, we're no closer to predicting the future than we were 100 years ago.
Yeah.
We can't. And IBP is a way to a keep track of what assumptions we used in the process that led to the decisions that we made. B, measure what the effect of those decisions was on our bottom line. And then C, collectively, by having all the right people review the information and in the room at the same time, decide on what the best approach to take going forward is. That doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree, but it means that
Mhm.
everybody's had a chance to have their input.
Now, I think one interesting thing you said there is obviously we don't want this process to be the place where we, hold people accountable for wrong decisions, but we do want to look at, okay, what's the process that got us here? But isn't an even more important one as a business, like, okay, we now have this 800 kilos of Gouda sitting in our warehouse. What are we going to do with it? What are the actions? Like it's maybe this is it's a bit more execution, but there's definitely place is there place in the S&OP IBP process to direct those decisions? So, okay, we've made a mistake. What can we do? What can we do to course correct? What can we actually still undertake to sell this
Well,
excess inventory?
bear in mind that ideally we're having conversations about an 18-month horizon.
Hmm.
So the fact that this month we have 800 kilos of Gouda is the end result of what ideally would have been 17 iterations of the review of that SKU.
Hmm.
If after 17 iterations we still got it wrong, which we're
Hmm.
going to be wrong to some extent every single month, um, there's two questions we have to ask. And the first, which is more IVP focused, is, you know, how do we learn from what led us to the point where we've got this heinous overstock of Gouda? Do we have the right people engaging with our customers? Are we talking to the right people on the customer side? Have we done everything we have to query the forecast process? I mean,
Hmm.
is our stat engine working properly to begin with? And the metrics will bear this out too. But the second part of that, which is what do we do now, to me is an execution question, which is
Hmm.
it's now become trendy to talk about S&OE. But the result of the strategic planning that you're doing in IBP and S&OP is the service levels today and inventory today and profitability today. And what you do with that today is an execution question, which
Hmm.
IBP needs to be aware of because it could have implications. But
Hmm.
but I think it's best dealt with not on a ad hoc and case by case basis, but rather on a process basis. I
Hmm.
mean, we should have made decisions on what our optimal
Sure.
inventory turns rate is by product class. Finance should have given us input on how much working capital we can tie up in inventory,
Hmm.
and that's going to help give guidance to how long can we go. And from that point, when we start falling into the slow and excess or obsolete category on certain classes of inventory, it's not really an IVP question. It's okay,
Hmm.
somewhere along the way, we missed something on the forecast. Now we're long on this. This is how we deal with that procedurally.
Hmm.
I
I
think
see.
when we get into tactics, when we get into the execution, I think there's much less need for consensus and discussion and collaboration. I think a lot of that stuff is best done up the funnel in the planning, and a lot of the execution can be rule based, can be even automated. Note that I said a lot before anyone jumps in and says I'm crazy.
Of course, we don't want to automate the promotion of that Gouda. There's too much at stake there. So with about 17 minutes left on this call, in about five to 7 minutes, I want to give some time for people to ask questions
I mean,
to
technically, there's
engage
been
in the
time for
call.
questions the whole time. No one's asked any yet.
Yeah, no, but yeah, let's you've been talking a lot, so they might want to put their thoughts, get their thoughts together. I want to talk a little bit before we go to questions, but I want to give people a heads up that they can think about questions to ask. I want to talk a little bit about technology. So,
Yeah.
we see that technology is playing a bigger part in the S&OP process and IBP process than it used to. And I want to talk about the role of technology in IBP and S&OP. So, how can we use it to actually facilitate? And I know you've been arguing against collaboration, but let's
No,
call it
no, I'm not arguing
collaboration.
against collaboration. I'm all for
No, no, not
collaboration. I'm
against.
against consensus.
Against consensus. Okay, I'll take that. So how can we really use it to facilitate collaboration across departments?
Yeah. Well, I think collaboration's one. You've kind of answered your own question there.
Mhm,
I think collaboration's one great thing, but I think there's a really important role that technology can play in mitigating some of the conflict as well.
mhm.
Anybody who, oh, Diego. I mean, if that's the Diego Santos, I think it is. Nice to see you. Um, been a long time. Um, Anybody who's done a program on negotiation will learn like two things in the very beginning of that program. The first is negotiation is 80% preparation, which isn't really what my point is right now. The point is the second thing, which is the thing that you're negotiating is usually not the thing you're negotiating. When you're trying to buy a used car, and this is the most common source of negotiation and conflict for a lot of people who would often never think at all about bargaining on the price of a banana or a shirt. When you're arguing about the price of a car, a used car, let's say the price of that car is $20,000. And you've gone back and forth 7 or 8 times, and you're talking about hundreds of dollars apart. Really, over the course of the period that you're going to finance that vehicle, if you're going to finance it, that $100 or even $500 is inconsequential. It's what accountants would say is immaterial.
Mhm,
But often the final 3 or 4 rounds of back and forth are taking place over tens of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, over a gap that is very, very small. Why is
mhm,
that? It has nothing to do with the money. It has nothing to do with the perceived value of the car. It's all about ego. It's all about the need that we have individually to win
mhm.
or to exert ourselves or be
Yeah.
heard. I mean, there's a host of psychological drivers. But the point is, there are all these psychological reasons that
Mhm,
we we want to be heard in discussions or have our viewpoint accepted in discussions. And,
mhm,
and it takes a lot of practice, and it takes the correct corporate culture to allow people to step away from their personal motivations and those things which for a lot of people are unconscious, like
mhm,
ego, in favor of the greater good, the greater mission. And where I think technology helps a lot is, rather than having people presenting all of the data and all of the metrics and a lot of the positions, by having people in a lot of these situations taken away from it, and the data just being presented as data as part of a dashboard, especially if it's automated. So it's no longer attached
mhm,
to, oh, this is Danny's demand review deck, or this is
mhm,
Jonathan's supply review deck. It's just, these are the metrics, and it came magically from technology. Now we're interrogating the data, and now we're interrogating the data without the consideration of personal egos or personal reputations or anything attached to it, and we're much more likely to be able to take a great path forward.
Mhm.
So I think technology, apart from you need it to facilitate IBP at scale, just because of how much data and measurement is required,
Mhm.
also has the added benefit of facilitating collaboration, because it can automate a lot of the steps that in the past
Mhm.
we've had to go through, manually populating decks, sending out emails, requesting information. A lot of that can be automated, or is automated now. But the second thing is it removes some of the human component that makes what should otherwise be an objective discussion. Um, it avoids devolving into what often becomes a personal discussion.
Mhm. So it's really kind of, I think part of it is really taking out the the forecast is something we generate based on data. Still talking about S&OP, IBP as a forecasting exercise, which is not always
Well, I
true
mean, it's
because
part of it.
it's part of it. You're taking out the piece where people drive that number. You drive it with data first, and then you make decisions about, okay, is this something we can actually commit to? Is this something we can do? But I think aside that, if we're looking at S&OP and IBP as an organization, we set a goal. Okay, we want to do $20 million a month, maybe 18 months from now. We look at the forecast that we generate within our company. We're 2 million short. So it's not a question of, okay, we just magically increase our forecast and it happens. It's also okay, it's a reality check, right? So that's where software can help with, by giving you a how do you say, okay, my mind is blanking here.
An unbiased view.
Unbiased. It's an unbiased view, or
Yeah.
relatively unbiased. So we have what we want to do, and we have the unbiased picture of what
Okay. Yeah. So what you're saying is
picture
technology has
gives.
identified the gap.
It's helping us identifying the gap by giving us an unbiased view, but
Sure.
that's
Yeah. And I
not.
think that's just a
Yeah.
different flavor of what I was saying. I think it's
Yeah.
one thing for a piece of software to say like, hey, uh, Danny and Jonathan Gouda company, you've got this gap, versus Danny coming to me and saying there's a gap,
Mm.
because data is just
Uh-huh.
data. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
listen, I'm not naive enough to think data is just data either. There's often unconscious biases baked into data too, but that's another conversation. But I think, yeah, having technology identify gaps, identify exceptions is different than a person saying we've got this exception, we've got this gap.
I know. I think the result of that can actually be companies undertaking the actions that we have to do to fix the gap, right? So if we're forecasting $18 million in cheese sales for January, but we want to reach 20 million, we got to do something. Like, it's not magically going to appear. It's not magically going to happen. And I think that's where software can really play a huge role, is by addressing those gaps and giving you the tools and actions available to resolve that. Um, that's something from my perspective as someone who mostly worked with software
And
implementations
sells it.
and solves those. Yes, I would like to say that. Especially, I think for a lot of people, the difference between SNOE and SNOP is still something that's it's hard to imagine, and a lot of people confuse the two. I think
A lot of people are doing
even
SNOE
Gartner
when they think they're
does.
doing SNOP, and I would argue software can do a lot of your SNOE. Like,
Mhm.
you should not be having as many people doing what they're doing in today's SNOE as they
Mhm.
are. You should have those people thinking strategically, thinking longer term in a real SNOP process.
Mhm.
And technology can free people up to do that.
All right, I think we're at the end of our conversation. Thanks, everyone. As I said, you'll get a copy of the slide deck, and we'll be in touch after the webinar. Jonathan, thanks again for being here and for your always great views on S&OP and IBP.
Absolutely.
And
Thanks for having me, Danny.
hope to see you at one of our next webinars. Pretty sure me and Jonathan will be on a couple of others in the future, and see you all soon.
Bye.